This move immediately opens diagonals for the queen and king's bishop, aiming for rapid development and central control, establishing a common foundation for many aggressive openings. By mirroring white's central pawn advance with 1, e5, black immediately stakes a claim in the center and opens lines for the queen and king's bishop, preparing for rapid development. This move, developing the knight to f3, is a fundamental principle of opening play, as it attacks black's central pawn on e5 and prepares for kingside castling, a crucial step in safeguarding the king. This move initiates a standard defense to white's attacking intentions with the king's knight, preparing for development and control of the d4 square. This move initiates the Lopez, a highly strategic opening aiming to control the center and prepare for a queenside pawn expansion, while simultaneously creating long-term pressure on black's position. This move, known as the Morphy defense, directly challenges the bishop, forcing white to either retreat or exchange, and prepares to gain space on the queenside if the bishop retreats. This move, a typical Lopez exchange variation, aims to disrupt black's pawn structure by creating doubled pawns on the c-file, weakening their queenside. Black's dx c6 resolves the tension, but weakens the queenside pawn structure by creating doubled pawns, which white can exploit later. White castles kingside, securing the king and preparing to connect the rooks for improved central control and potential play on the kingside or along open files. This move weakens the dark squares around the king and creates a potential target for white's pieces. This move boldly challenges black's central pawn structure, aiming to open lines for white's pieces and exploit the doubled c-pawns black acquired earlier. This capture opens the d-file for white's queen and frees black's bishop on c8, while also creating a doubled pawn for black on the c-file, which can become a strategic weakness later. This move recaptures the pawn on d4, developing the knight to a central square where it exerts pressure on black's queenside pawn structure. This move repositions the knight from a more active central square to a less ideal square, potentially hindering black's development and pawn structure. This move develops the bishop to an active square, eyeing the d4 pawn and preparing to support a central pawn push or further piece development. This move repositions the knight to a potentially more active square, aiming to control central squares and support a future kingside pawn advance. This move prepares to redeploy the knight to a more active central square like c4 or f3, supporting the central pawn majority and potentially attacking the weak pawn on c6. This move aims to activate the bishop and prepare for a potential kingside attack, while also creating a defensive pawn shield for the king. This move repositions the knight to a more active square, preparing to contest the c-file and potentially target black's pawn structure. This move prioritizes king safety, a crucial strategic element, and prepares to develop the remaining pieces, particularly the rook, to an active central file. This move prepares to centralize the queen, supporting a d4-d5 pawn push to gain space and potentially attack black's slightly passive pawn structure. This knight move repositions the knight to a more active square, attacking white's queen and aiming to control central squares. This move simplifies the position and resolves black's knight on e5, which was a well-placed piece controlling important central squares. This recapture on e5, while seemingly natural, creates a doubled pawn for black on the c-file and consolidates white's central pawn presence, potentially leading to a positional advantage for white if they can exploit the weakened c-pawn structure. This move actively challenges black's central pawn presence, aiming to open lines and create attacking opportunities for white's pieces. This move redirects the bishop to a more active diagonal, reinforcing the central pawn on d4 and preparing to challenge white's f4 pawn. This aggressive pawn thrust opens lines and restricts black's knight, creating imbalances for dynamic play. This move, k7, prepares to potentially double the rooks on the e-file and supports the e5 pawn, while also offering a pathway for the queen to participate in the central struggle. The move 15, bf4, repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, aiming to pressure black's kingside and potentially support a future pawn advance while also clearing the d3 square for the queen. Black exchanges the dark-squared bishop for white's light-squared bishop, aiming to improve piece coordination and potentially target white's weakened light squares. This rook sacrifice on f4 opens the f-file and targets black's exposed king, aiming to exploit the weakened pawn structure after white's aggressive pawn pushes. This move develops the bishop to a more active square, eyeing the c6 pawn and preparing to potentially contest the open d-file. Reactivating the rook to the open e-file centralizes it and prepares potential pressure against black's king or pawn weaknesses. The move 17, qc5, repositions the queen to the center, challenging the advanced d4 pawn and indirectly pressuring the f4 rook, while also preparing to potentially contest the c-file. This move reinforces the d4 pawn, solidifying white's central control and preparing to challenge black's bishop on d6. The rook on e8 joins the fight for the open e-file, preparing to potentially double rooks or support a pawn advance in the center. This aggressive pawn push aims to gain space on the kingside and potentially open lines for your rooks, but it weakens the dark squares around your king and requires careful defense. This move reactivates the queen to a more central square, eyeing white's kingside pawn push and potentially preparing to contest the open e-file. The move qg3 centralizes the queen, preparing to attack the kingside and potentially exploit the weakened g-file pawn structure if white can open it further. The move 20, re7, aims to consolidate the rook, support the e-pawn, and prepare for potential pawn advances on the kingside or to contest the central files more effectively. This knight retreat to f3 prepares to support a potential kingside pawn advance or to regroup to a more central square, while also guarding against black's doubling of rooks on the e-file. Black initiates a central pawn break with c5, aiming to contest white's central pawn majority and potentially open lines for their pieces, especially the queen and rook on the c-file. This pawn thrust opens lines and creates immediate threats against black's queenside structure and king, aiming to exploit the weaknesses created by the pawn advance. This pawn sacrifice opens lines for your pieces and aims to disrupt white's pawn center, creating dynamic counterplay. This move repositions the rook to the more active fourth rank, potentially supporting a pawn advance or preparing to contest the e-file, while also reinforcing the center. Black repositions the bishop to the c6 square to support the pawn on c5 and potentially create counterplay on the queenside. This move clears the e-file for the rook, aiming to exploit the open nature of the central files and potentially attack black's king position, or create decisive pressure along the diagonal opened by the exchange on e5. The recapture of the rook on e8 aims to free the pinned knight and activate the black queen, while simultaneously challenging white's dominant rook on the e-file. This exchange simplifies the position, removing complicating pieces and allowing white to focus on leveraging the open e-file and potential passed d-pawn. This recapture simplifies the position and activates the rook to contest the newly opened e-file, aiming to exploit white's slightly passive pawn structure. This move repositions the knight to a more active central square, potentially preparing to attack weakened squares or to support a pawn advance, while also challenging black's central control. This move aims to create a pawn shelter for the king, preventing potential checks on the g-file and preparing for future pawn advances to gain space. This move prepares to create a protected passed pawn on the h-file, potentially opening lines for the king or creating a strategic advantage on the queenside. The move bd7 repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, supporting potential pawn advances on the kingside and preparing to contest the c-file should it open. The move qf4 aims to centralize the queen, prepare for potential kingside advances, and keep an eye on the e5 pawn, which is now indirectly defended by the rook on e7. This move reiterates the threat to the d4 pawn and also prepares to defend the kingside by possibly redeploying the queen to a more active defensive square. This move prepares to centralize the rook by potentially moving it to d2, aiming to activate it on the d-file or support a pawn push. This move repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, eyeing the white king and preparing to contest the e-file if white decides to double rooks. This move utilizes a discovered check to disrupt black's coordinated pieces and force material advantage. As the queen is now under direct attack, the king steps to safety on h7, creating a vital escape square and avoiding potential checks along the open diagonal or along the g-file. This move redirects the knight to a more active square, aiming to create attacking chances on the kingside, potentially targeting the f4 square or supporting a pawn push. This exchange simplifies the position, removing potential attackers for white's king while clearing the way for black's rook to activate on the now open e-file. This move recaptures the knight on g6, simplifying the position and maintaining control of the important central squares while preparing to support the advance of the f-pawn. This move repositions the bishop to defend the vulnerable c6 pawn and prepare for potential counterplay along the c-file. The move *3-3 k7 is a strong defensive move, centralizing the queen to defend the d7 bishop from any potential discoveries and preparing to support the king should it need to move. Black recaptures on e7 to simplify the position and prevent white's knight from establishing a strong outpost on f5, though it does create a slightly easier endgame for white. This move simplifies into a king and pawn endgame where white has a decisive material advantage and a stronger pawn structure, making the win straightforward. This pawn push on g5 weakens the kingside pawn structure, creating potential targets for white's pieces in the endgame. This move, hxg5, opens the h-file for white's rook, creating potential attacking lines against black's king and also simplifying the position by exchanging material in the endgame. The pawn capture on g5 creates an open h-file for white's rook and opens up black's kingside for potential future attacks, although it also solidifies the kingside pawn structure. The knight repositions to d5, centralizing itself and eyeing weaknesses on the queenside while also preparing to potentially support a pawn push on the kingside if the opportunity arises. The bishop returns to c6 to defend the pawn on c5 and potentially support a kingside advance if white's knight moves from d5. This move exploits black's weakened queenside pawn structure, directly attacking the c7 pawn, which is now undefended after the exchange on e7 and the knight's repositioning to d5. Black's bishop advances to f3, aiming to create potential mating threats by attacking the compromised kingside and disrupting white's coordination. The knight's relocation to e8 aims to provoke black into advancing their g-pawn further, potentially creating weaknesses in their kingside pawn structure and opening lines for white's remaining pieces. The king seeks safety on the kingside, anticipating potential threats from white's knight and rook after the recent exchanges. The knight on f6 now controls crucial central squares, supports a potential pawn advance, and restricts black's king's movement while preparing to attack the bishop on d7. The king retreats to g7, seeking a safer square away from the active knight and potential checks on the h-file, while preparing to support the bishop on d7. The king is brought into the center of the action to support the advance of the g-pawn and prepare for active play in the endgame. This move repositions the bishop to an active square, aiming to contest the important d1 square and potentially prepare for further king side action or exchanges if white's king advances. nd7 aims to reroute the knight to better squares like c5 or b6 to support the passed pawns and attack black's queenside majority. This pawn advance attempts to create a protected passed pawn on the c-file, potentially disrupting white's pieces and creating active counterplay. The king is actively participating in the endgame, moving to support the knight's advanced position and prepare for potential pawn advances while coordinating with the remaining pieces.